John Dillinger is the most famous bank robber in history and was chased for a year by almost all law enforcement agencies in the United States. During this time, he managed to rob about 24 banks for a sum of $500,000. During his lifetime, he was called a gentleman bandit and a modern-day Robin Hood. And his death was the starting point after which Hoover and the FBI really gained power. About a dozen movies have been made about him, and even more books have been written. Pieces of his tombstone have been taken several times by fans from all over the world, and everyone who knew him made money for the rest of their lives just from stories about Dillinger. But is his story so unequivocal? Was this man really the American Robin Hood, and why did one single year of his life give him fame that lives on to this day? We will tell you about this and much more in our video today. And if you are interested in the real story of America's top enemy and going beyond the now trite framework of his conflict with Hoover, then meet John Dillinger on the other side of the law. In the summer of 1887, the eldest child of French immigrant Matthias Dillinger named John met Molly Lancaster, a pretty girl from a large family. John and Molly married before the summer was over and opened a grocery store near Brightwood in the Oak Hill neighborhood of Indianapolis. Their firstborn, a girl named Audrey, was born in 1889, and her infamous brother would not be born until the next century. He was christened John Herbert Dillinger. The family would refer to him simply as Junior. John's mother died when he was not yet 5 years old, and due to this, he lived with his older sister until he was 9, as his father could not cope alone. He moved back to his father's house when John Sr. found a new wife named Lizzie Fields, who gave birth to 3 more children. How all this affected John Jr. remains a mystery. Some say that his father and stepmother showered him with love and attention, while others portrayed John Sr. as aloof and cruel. It's reliably known that John Jr. often ran away from home, and shortly after his father's second marriage, he became the head of the local Dirty Dozen gang. By the time Dillinger went to 6th grade, he led the most daring gang members in raids on the Pennsylvania Railroad. They would steal coal from cars on the loop line running through Oak Hill, and their neighbors would happily buy up the loot. One day, some ambitious women asked Dillinger if he would sell the coal cheaper if they helped to get it off the tracks. Since the boys were anxious to go to Riverside Park that day, they agreed. While the car was being unloaded, Dillinger's right-hand man, Freddie Whiteside, spotted a railroad officer approaching from around the bend. The boys disappeared in lightning speed, but the women were caught. That same night, however, police arrested Dillinger and the other juvenile delinquents. Because of their young age, they all escaped punishment that time. In adolescence, entertaining himself became more and more dangerous. For example, John Jr. crashed an unattended car into a coal train for fun. Often he stole whiskey from freight cars, and a couple of times he showed up at school drunk. Sharing the stolen goods, Dillinger learned fairly early the meaning of the poem by American poet Ogden Nash. "Candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker." He treated girls to stolen whiskey, then treated himself. Passion for the opposite sex came early for him. By the age of 16, John Jr. was tired of school life. He found a job at a plywood veneer factory and declared his schoolwork done, but he didn't last there long. He soon left the factory job for a more interesting position as a courier for the Indiana Chamber of Commerce. However, even that bored him, and after 4 months he left, taking a position as a mechanic in James P. Burcham's factory. John worked well everywhere, but he left as soon as he had money to spend. That is, he worked hard for 2 or 3 weeks, then quit his job and partied until his pockets were empty. Then he'd go back to work. In 1920, John Sr. decided to return to farming. He bought a 62-acre tract of land in Mooresville on the northwest edge of Indianapolis. John Jr. lived there with his family, but he didn't like it on the farm. The one thing about country life that Jr. enjoyed was hunting. When he wasn't playing basketball for the Mooresville sports team, he was usually out hunting. He was skillful with a gun and a good shot, John Sr. later said. It was there that Jr. also mastered automobiles. His first vehicle was a motorcycle, and then he started driving a Chevy. In addition to driving, he liked to dive inside the automobile so that he could completely disassemble and reassemble an entire car. In 1923, a 20-year-old Dillinger became interested in reading books about the famous outlaw of the Wild West, Jesse James. They were pulp novels that mixed fact with fiction, elevating the gunslinger to the status of a romanticized legend. His childhood friend, Delbert Hobson, said that John Jr. was impressed by James' bravery and daring, as well as his chivalrous attitude toward women and children, which later may well have been reflected in his style of robbing banks. Meanwhile, he continued to play baseball in neighboring Martinsville, but only as a hobby. Dillinger was never a professional player like some sources claim. Despite John's popularity with the opposite sex, his first love still broke his heart. Her name was Frances Thornton, and she was his uncle's stepdaughter. John offered her his hand and heart, but the elders advised him not to rush and wait a few months, after which Frances, tuned out by her stepfather and the angsty Dillinger, simply stopped talking to John. At the same time, it became known that a certain girl in Indianapolis was pregnant with John's child. All of this combined, as many sources believe, and pushed Dillinger to his first rash act. On a July night in 1923, in a stolen car with a revolver in the glove compartment, Dillinger parked conspicuously, finding himself in an African-American neighborhood of Indianapolis. He was likely at that pregnant girl's house and was walking back when his path was blocked by police officers. They searched him and then the car, where they found the gun. Dillinger barely managed to get away. After that, John decided to join the Navy as soon as possible to avoid punishment. It wasn't the first time the Navy had taken in troubled young men. They knew there wasn't much time when it came to unexpected, undocumented volunteers, so they sent him to a training base 4 days later. Dillinger completed basic training on October 4, 1923, and was assigned to the battleship USS Utah as a stoker. After 22 days of grueling labor, he had had enough. He left the ship at Boston and went AWOL, probably to cool off. Upon his return, a court-martial demerit, a fine of $18, almost a month's pay back then, and a 10-day stay in a penal cell on bread and water were added to his growing record. The delay in carrying out the sentence gave Dillinger an invaluable opportunity to make more trouble. On November 9th, instead of settling down, the restless young man left his official post. So 5 more days of solitary confinement were added to his previous sentence. A few weeks after his release on December 4th, 1923, John escaped again, whereupon he was placed on the deserters list and a $50 bounty put on his head. Half a century of detailed research never established where Dillinger had been or what he had been doing since December 1923, until he turned up in his homeland the following March. His family believed he had been faithfully serving in the Navy that whole time. When he returned, however, he claimed he had been discharged from the service because of a heart murmur. He had no fear of the courts, and he had managed to act up in front of both civilians and the military. No, he had no fear whatsoever. Dillinger went only a month without major events after his return, and in April 1924, he married a 17-year-old girl named Beryl Ethelhovius. But the quiet life wasn't John's style. He needed to work constantly. There was no time to smoke, and his wife saw when he brought a bit of extra money or came home drunk. And so, either to escape from this routine life or to bring home more money, Dillinger formed his first grown-up gang of guys who he hung out with in the local bar. It's not known how many jobs Dillinger's first gang did before they were caught stealing 41 chickens. The father somehow managed to negotiate a dismissal of the case, but it finally broke him and his son apart. Honest and upstanding John Sr. felt that his boy had taken a wrong turn. The next step leading Dillinger into the world of crime was his reconciliation with a distant relative of his mother, William Edgar Singleton, who had already served a decent sentence. At the time of their acquaintance, Singleton was a hard-drinking, 31-year-old father of 2, who somehow miraculously managed to hold down a decent job in a Mooresville factory. During the summer of 1924, Singleton and Dillinger joined forces, pulling off a couple of successful gas station robberies, and on September 6, 1924, they targeted an elderly grocer named Frank Morgan, who had a habit of pocketing the day's proceeds and walking home down a dark street without any means of self-defense. The plan was elegant and simple. Dillinger would be the assailant and Singleton the driver. That evening, armed with a .32 caliber pistol and a cloth-wrapped handle, Dillinger took Morgan, who had just closed his store, by surprise. Dillinger knocked the man to the ground, striking him in the head with the handle. But Morgan was wearing a straw hat to soften the blow, so the elderly grocer not only didn't faint, but jumped up and knocked the gun out of the hands of the novice thief, who then fired it into the air. Surprised by Morgan's quickness, Dillinger, who was probably drunk, panicked and ran to where Singleton was supposed to be waiting. But the latter, startled by the gunshot, had already left. The inexperienced Dillinger went to a nearby billiard room and immediately began asking customers about the shot, which, as it turned out, no one had heard. But his questions were later remembered and got John noticed with his hands red. For now, Dillinger returned to his father's farm on foot. It didn't take a Sherlock Holmes to figure out the case, and on Monday, a day and a half later, a deputy sheriff drove to Dillinger's farm and arrested the lousy burglar. John later admitted to the district attorney that he had indeed attacked the grocer, but cited being drunk and under Singleton's influence. His father and he believed that a guilty plea would elicit leniency from the judge. They were wrong. In court on September 15th, Dillinger pleaded guilty to assault and robbery at his father's insistence. John had all the reasons for a lenient sentence: a good family, married, no criminal record. But instead of the expected light verdict, Judge Joseph Williams gave him the maximum penalty of 10 years in prison. The case was telling. The recently elected judge wanted to demonstrate that he was not going to give leniency to lousy ruffians. Although John had indeed attacked the grocer, it later turned out that all the evidence against him was circumstantial and might not have been corroborated had it been presented in court with its fair due. During his lifetime, John Dillinger's unjust conviction was constantly used as a reason, and even a justification, for his future life of crime. Singleton's sentence also added fuel to the fire. He was given 3 times less for his sentencing. After this, John felt betrayed by the system. He even said at the time that when he got out, he would be the meanest bastard the world had ever seen. Dillinger ended up in Pendleton, a grim prison facility that was a row of brown brick buildings with red tile roofs, 30-foot-tall concrete walls, and artillery towers at each corner. The facility housed 4 commercial factories run by civilians who willingly took advantage of the prisoners' almost free labor. The factories produced clothing, furniture, dishes, and sewer manhole covers. What the prisoners hated most was the hard work in the infernally hot manhole factory. And as a newcomer, Dillinger was, of course, put there. In the first 90 days of his incarceration, he tried to escape twice, which added a year to his sentence. The first time, he hid in a pile of shavings in the same foundry where they produced manhole covers, but he was spotted by the head of security, who defiantly announced, "Now let's set these shavings on fire." Dillinger immediately climbed out, getting 6 more months for attempted escape. But before Christmas, he tried again with the help of 2 accomplices who had a hacksaw used to saw through the bars. John was confident in the success of his operation and even wrote to his wife, "I'll be home for the holidays." Yet they failed to get farther than the hall, and Dillinger's sentence increased by another 6 months. In the following months, he received an additional year, and in March 1927, he fell seriously ill with diphtheria. About the same time, news reached him that Singleton had been released on parole for good behavior, and according to his cellmates, he became really upset. Until 1928, he behaved quietly, recovering from his illness and the unpleasant news, but then he received several more new reprimands with an extension on his sentence. In the early years of his imprisonment, his family visited him about once a month, but gradually the visits became less and less frequent. In April 1929, he and his wife Beryl filed for divorce. However, not all was so deplorable, for in prison, John began to make useful criminal connections, and with some he even made a real friendship. The first such friend was Harry Pete Pierpont, a slender, handsome young man under 6 feet 2 inches tall. He was only a year older than Dillinger but was already considered unreformable. He had a botched carjacking attempt at age 19 in Indianapolis with a stolen firearm and a bank robbery to his credit. In Pendleton, he didn't stay long. 2 months later, Pierpont was caught attempting to break out and was transferred to the more restrictive prison in Michigan City. At the time of Pierpont's transfer, John was assigned to work in a shirt factory for good behavior. Here he grew very close to Homer Van Meter. Homer was an unusual guy. With a height of about 5 feet 11, he weighed only 120 pounds. He was also a repeat offender and got into Pendleton for robbing passengers on the New York Central Railroad of a few $100s. And from there, he was transferred to the penitentiary in Michigan City, like Pierpont, for attempted escape. Soon, Dillinger would join them, but in a very unconventional way. In the summer of 1929, John applied for parole, but the parole board turned him down. He then asked them for a transfer to Michigan City, which was stricter and more dangerous than Pendleton, to the commission's surprise. Dillinger's motivation was the good baseball team there that he wanted to play on. Everyone knew he wasn't a bad player at all, so the request was granted. On July 15, 1929, John Dillinger was escorted to Michigan City and soon found himself within the same walls as 2 of his only friends, Harry Pierpont and Homer Van Meter. He was 26 years old. Every prisoner there lived in a 3 by 2 foot cell lit by a dim light bulb. There were no books, magazines, or newspapers, and each prisoner was allowed only 1 bar of soap, a corncob pipe, tobacco, and a towel. He could smoke in his cell 3 times in an evening, his pipe or cigarette lit by the officer on duty who carried a match from one place to another. Professional criminals were rare in Pendleton, mostly small-time lawbreakers who got in by dumb bad luck. Here, however, were the hardened crooks and robbers. John was like a choir boy to them, and an aspiring young delinquent had a lot to learn from the professors of crime gathered there. Dillinger was sent to the shirt factory there, where he was in charge of the collar sewing operation. He was joined by men whose names would later make headlines as the Dillinger Gang: Harry Pete Pierpont, Charles Mackley, and Russell Clark. Gradually adjusting to his new surroundings, Dillinger tried to avoid minor disciplinary issues. His second parole hearing was approaching, and this time he wanted at least a chance. 3 years later, by March 1933, Dillinger was very optimistic about his chances for release. He even devised a strategy involving his relatives. The Dillinger family sent in a parole petition in April 1933. The gist was that John was needed on the farm to help his old father during those hard times. In addition, the petition mentioned that his stepmother, Lizzie, had been hospitalized due to a lingering illness. Further, the Dillingers put together a support group of well-meaning and influential citizens. The county sheriff spoke in favor of Dillinger Jr., as well as the court clerk, auditor, treasurer, recorder, and assessor. Audrey managed to persuade the very aggrieved grocer Frank Morgan and Judge Joe Williams to leave their signatures as well. In all, the Dillingers gathered up 188 people. Plus, his fellow Hoosier, Paul McNutt, was running for governor, and when he reached his 10-year sentence, John's case was considered not by the prison's board of trustees, who would have denied him, but by the governor's board of paroles. The board consisted of 3 men, 2 of which voted in favor of John's release, and that was enough to set him free. John's old buddy, Homer Van Meter, also successfully applied for parole and was free by the end of May. The commission's decision, for some reason, didn't reach Dillinger until 11 days later. During that time, his stepmother Lizzie became gravely ill in Mooresville. When Dillinger did reach home, it turned out that Lizzie had already died. She was buried 2 days later, on May 25, 1933, in the same plot where his mother, Molly, had been buried 27 years earlier. When he first got to town, many people really believed that John was reformed, though, as you saw, this was not the case. By day, he was an affable and friendly citizen in a white hat, but by night he would turn back into a thug. Within weeks of his release, he was already prowling Indianapolis at night looking for profit. By the time he got out, America was no longer the plentiful land he remembered. In Indiana, 100,000 people were sitting on welfare, and across the country, more than 10 million people were out of work. Times were troubled and tough, and many chose to head down a crooked path. In 1932, while John Dillinger was still behind bars, some dashing bandits had robbed 631 banks, including as many as 85 in Illinois alone. John was ready to do the same. In prison, he met lots of bandits, and in addition to their experience, he received a list of the least protected banks in the Midwest, which in the slang of the time were called jugs. In May 1933, Dillinger joined a gang of amateur criminals in Indianapolis known as the Whitecaps. Wearing identical clothing was a hallmark of such gangs, as witnesses often remembered clothes rather than faces. But this was perhaps their only success. Using stolen guns and cars, the gang specialized in robbing small establishments like convenience stores and pharmacies. The robberies were almost never planned, so they often got into ridiculous situations. In addition, only a few in the gang knew how to handle a gun, and they were faulty drivers. Not much of a public enemy number one, you might agree. For example, one night the Whitecap gang got chased by the police before the robbery even began. They were stealing a car, the police spotted them, and as they drove off, one of the criminals didn't have time to close the door, so it got knocked by a lamppost they unexpectedly hit on the way. Then, with the door torn off, they attracted the attention of another patrol but escaped safely from both. Another of their robberies was also known to have gone wrong. An old grocery store owner was unable to comply with the robbers' demands out of sheer terror. In an outburst, Dillinger hit the old guy in the face with his pistol and broke the man's dentures. The blow was so careless that knocked out teeth and blood spatter flew onto the criminal. Several other similar incidents are known from early in his career, and they somewhat discredited the image of a gentleman's gangster that Dillinger was later portrayed as in the press. He soon left the Whitecaps along with another member named Copeland, realizing that the others were only amateurs and their inexperience would eventually lead him back to jail. Now, in early June 1933, without the Whitecaps, Dillinger successfully robbed the National Bank in New Carlisle, Northern Ohio, with two accomplices, taking $10,000. The next documented bank theft Dillinger committed was just 1 month later, July 17, 1933, in Indiana, in the town of Daleville. It was in this robbery that he first used his famous trick, jumping spectacularly over the counter. The amount of loot from the Daleville bank was only $3,500, but Dillinger and Copeland easily fled and took a jewelry box. 2 days later, on July 19th, Dillinger and Copeland robbed the Rockville National Bank in western Indiana. Afterward, Dillinger decided to take a break and visit the sister of a Michigan City inmate named Mary Longnecker. Clearly infatuated with Mary, the bandit dreamed of moving with her and her children to either South America or Mexico, but her husband would not grant her a divorce. In an attempt to expedite the divorce proceedings, Dillinger visited Mary's husband's place of employment, and of course, the matter ended in a fight. The town constable was called in and took Dillinger into custody. He put the detainee behind the wheel of his own car, jumped on the running board, and told him to go to the station. Dillinger, on the other hand, threw the llama into the pavement and sped off into the sunset without a scratch. The situation was getting hairy, and Dillinger could not stay in Dayton, so he went to his sister Audrey Hancock in Indianapolis, then to his father in Mooresville. At both locations, he was accompanied by an unexpected chip on his shoulders, which journalists would christen Dillinger's luck. The fact is that the supervising officer revoked Dillinger's parole due to violations. However, for what exactly is not known. 2 agents were assigned to Audrey's place, and they fell sound asleep just when John was getting to his sister's house, totally out of hiding. Dillinger again eluded authorities at the Mooresville farm, this time even leaving his father a birthday present of a shirt and tie right under the noses of the lawmen. Putting aside romantic and family matters, and held up by his unprecedented good fortune, Dillinger decided to get back to work. His next target was the small town of Montpelier in eastern Indiana. On August 5th, Dillinger, Copeland, and an unknown driver parked at the entrance to the Montpelier National Bank. Dillinger entered the bank, swung firmly over the teller gate, and stuffed more than $12,000 into a sugar sack, in the end leaving both the bank and the city unscathed. Next, John rented a series of apartments in East Chicago, Indiana, and started scouting other banks. He had not yet attracted the attention of the higher echelons since he was a petty thief, but some police officers had already taken him onto their radar. One of them was Matthew "Matt" Leach, a captain of the Indiana State Police. Leach had entered the chase for Dillinger in early July 1933, and his amazing bad luck became an inexhaustible source for jokes. 2-minute late Leach, as he was known, always appeared on the scene, only to catch a glimpse of the bumper of Dillinger's car disappearing into the distance. It was Leach who visited Dillinger's farm while he left a gift for his father and fled. Leach would become the object of teasing throughout the next year as he pursued Dillinger. For example, he had a stutter, and Dillinger never missed an opportunity to heartlessly mock him for it. He called Leach on more than one occasion, mimicking his speech. The Indiana police, however, tried to organize themselves through Leach's initiative. For example, they began keeping a dossier on the perpetrator, tracked all mail going to Dillinger's relatives in Maywood and Mooresville, and later wiretapped his phone conversations. They obtained samples of Dillinger's handwriting, intercepted and reconciled letters, put every place he visited under surveillance, but all to no avail. Dillinger was one step ahead all along. The full story of his possible connection to law enforcement is still unknown. He may have been bribing unscrupulous members of the local police, promptly receiving information about setups, which helped him to be so successful in his getaways. A connection with the East Chicago Police Department is often pointed out, and will still come up in our story, but there's no solid evidence to support this accusation. One thing is certain. Emboldened by his success, Dillinger expanded the size of his gang and its training, and began using the methodical approach to bank robbery that he had learned in prison. This, along with the new technology available, made him a formidable opponent for law officers. Bank robberies in the United States began in the 19th century, but it wasn't until the early 20th century that a German immigrant named Hermann Lamb introduced a new systematic approach to the occupation. It began with a study of the principles of bank operation. Different people were used for different duties in a robbery: watchers outside, robbers inside, driver, etc. The robberies were also timed and rehearsed. Each step was carefully planned, and the escape was a key element of Lamb's method. It became a kind of art in itself. To get away, the bandits would usually use stolen cars, then transfer to other cars a few miles from the scene of the crime. On their way out of the bank, they would scatter roofing nails along the road. Since cars of the time were equipped with tube chambers and thin tires, this tactic was often successful. The route of retreat was planned especially carefully, always bypassing major highways. But study plans were not Dillinger's only advantage. Several new technologies and inventions played just as important a role in his successes, such as new guns and fast cars, which were not available to the police at the time. First, the bandits had the most modern weapon, the Thompson submachine gun. Police officers, on the other hand, were mostly armed with low-caliber pistols, leaving them at a disadvantage. Second, criminals quickly realized the advantage of speed and an 8-cylinder engine. Dillinger favored the Hudson Essex Terraplane, a car with a small trunk, 17-inch wheels, and a powerful engine. It was hard to drive such a car, but it was fast, and Dillinger was a very skillful driver. 3rd, the bandits had mastered another echo of war: body armor. It was slung over the shoulders and had many pockets which held lead rods. Such vests, capable of withstanding the kinds of small-caliber bullets used by the police, saved the lives of Dillinger and his gang more than once. As July 1933 turned smoothly into August, his eye fell on Ohio. With a powerful new gang of 5, the bandit arrived in Bluffton on August 14th. He had a fast, modern car and heavy artillery. The Bank of Bluffton was one of the places where new technology was used to protect against criminals. The safe had a timer set to open only at a certain time that the robbers didn't know about, and this annoying detail changed the course of the robbery. Dillinger and his partner entered the hall. John jumped over the counter and ordered the cashiers to fill a pillowcase with cash. They then went to the timer safe, which there was no way to open, and it probably made the thieves very upset. Then, the second newest technology came into play: an alarm system. The button was either wired to the police station or to a bell attached to the outside wall of the building. Bluffton had the second option, and while Dillinger was grumbling at the timer, the alarm rang deafeningly outdoors. Gunshots rang from outside, one of the gang members firing a line of automatic weapons into the air to push back the crowd that was gathered around the bank. Defeated by the timer, Dillinger left the premises with a paltry $2,100. The 5 bandits jumped into a car, on the way firing their guns over the crowd to disperse it a bit. The police never made it to the scene, and the event was so nerve-wracking that terrified eyewitnesses couldn't even identify the make of the car the criminals were in. From start to finish, the robbery lasted 5 minutes. By early fall, Dillinger returned to his native Indianapolis with a small gang of only 3 men and robbed the Massachusetts Avenue State Bank of $24,000. This time, there was no doubt who the culprit was, as Dillinger acrobatically jumped over the counters and generously left some money behind. These first robberies were quite memorable and a spectacle, and served as the first building blocks of the media component around Dillinger's life. And John's behavior during the robbery, which was recounted to the press by eyewitnesses, became the basis for the legend of a modern Robin Hood. Because in the process, John always remained cool and calm, smiled disarmingly despite the flying bullets and deafening ringing of the alarm, and was always courteous with the hostages, and let them go unharmed, sometimes with money. In September 1933, John Dillinger interrupted a string of successful robberies to settle matters in his personal and professional life. The professional one was the release of his dear pal, Harry Pierpont, who had never been granted parole. After taking a cut from the Indianapolis case, Dillinger bought pistols and delivered them to the prison. He had a middleman from a shirt factory who was able to smuggle them in boxes of string. Things didn't work out so well on the personal side. Because of his frequent changes of residence, Dillinger had been unable to meet with his sweetheart, Mary from Dayton, the one he planned to take to South America. Finally, after a successful exchange of letters, a meeting was arranged. These communications were just as successfully intercepted by Dayton City Police, and an ambush was set up at Mary's apartment building, resulting in John's arrest. News of Dillinger's arrest spread quickly among both law enforcement and the criminal community. Investigators from Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Ohio were eager to talk to him, but he didn't want to talk back. Ballistic tests on his guns did not match any of the results of various robberies, especially those in which officers, police, or citizens were injured or killed, so no charges could be brought against him on that account. Then a group of witnesses to the mid-July robbery were brought in, and they identified Dillinger as the robber. That gave prosecutors the opportunity to schedule a hearing for September 30th. 4 days after John's arrest on September 26th, 10 inmates escaped from the Michigan City prison using guns that Dillinger had given them. Among the escapees were Harry Pierpont, John Hamilton, Charles Mackley, and Russell Clark, soon to become members of Dillinger's gang. The group actually walked out the front door of the prison, Using contraband weapons, they took hostages, moving from room to room, eventually breaking themselves free. Outside the walls of the jail was a Chevy that belonged to the sheriff delivering a new inmate. 4 of the gang climbed into the car with the sheriff as a hostage and sped away. The other 6, including Pierpont, ran across the prison yard to the gas station and demanded the keys to the duty officer's car. The officer refused and attempted to flee, suffering a minor injury. The 6 convicts eventually confiscated a car from a senior couple and sped out of Michigan City. The first group of 4 inmates got their Chevy stuck in the mud a few miles from the prison. One of them was killed and the other 3 were arrested. The group of 6, including Pierpont, was luckier. Zigzagging south through Indiana, they reached Indianapolis. After changing clothes, Pierpont's group headed for Ohio and immediately began planning the release of their savior Dillinger, who was now awaiting trial behind bars. Meanwhile, Harry Copeland, Dillinger's former partner in Indiana, joined Pierpont's gang in Ohio. To free Dillinger, they needed money, and to get it, Pierpont, Hamilton, and Clark robbed a bank in St. Mary's. The robbery brought in over $14,000. Dillinger was transferred at this time to a facility in the town of Lima. Good news for his liberators, since it was much less guarded than his former place of confinement. Before going to prison, John had met another woman, who he then grew greatly attached to. Her name was Evelyn Frechette, Billy for short. She had French and American Indian roots and was born on the Menominee Reservation in Wisconsin in 1907. She was just over 5 feet tall with black hair, brown eyes, and high cheekbones. Women who were married to, lived with, or traveled with bank robbers and other crooks were often referred to as molls by the press. The role of women was often downplayed by the media or ignored altogether. However, many researchers argue that these women prolonged the criminal careers of their boyfriends or husbands by renting apartments, buying cars, treating wounds, acting as couriers, and serving as covers. Frechette clearly fit the definition of a moll. Dillinger met her in Chicago when she was working at a dance hall. Dillinger was fascinated by her glossy black eyes and haunting beauty. Frechette was equally drawn to Dillinger. "I was 25 years old, out of a failed marriage, and when I met John, everything changed," she said of their first meeting. At the time of Dillinger's arrest in Dayton and time served in Lima, Frechette was in Kokomo, Indiana. Somehow, the lovesick Dillinger had indicated that he wanted her by his side if he managed to escape, so Pierpont sent for her. And while Dillinger's romantic affairs were being resolved, painstaking work was going on to make his escape plan a reality. The gang's first idea was to use a lawyer to bribe Lima's sheriff, Jess Sarber, who was guarding John, but he wouldn't sell out. So they had to take the more difficult route. On October 11th, Pierpont, Clark, Mackley, Hamilton, and Edward Schaus drove 2 cars into Lima to inspect the town and the jail. On October 12th, the 5 returned to Lima for action. Simulating a bank robbery plan, Pierpont, Clark, and Mackley entered the prison. Schaus served as a lookout. Hamilton stayed with the 2 getaway cars. Sheriff Sarber, his wife Lucy, and the deputy sat in the office. It was 6:30 p.m. Dinner for the inmates had just ended. Neither Sarber nor the deputy had any weapons. The sheriff did not take the potential danger his inmate posed seriously. When the 3 entered the jail, they told the sheriff that they had come from Michigan City to take Dillinger there. Sarber did not believe them, so he got severely injured by a bullet from a pistol. The criminals, however, took the keys to the cells and went after Dillinger. On their way back, Clark and Pierpont locked the men who had been with Sarber in the cell, preventing them from calling for help for the dying sheriff. When help finally arrived, it was too late. Sarber passed away in the hospital. Outraged, Lima residents formed into 6 posses to pursue Dillinger and his accomplices, but they got away without a trace. That was how serious violence got into Dillinger's world. After all, a bleeding, unarmed sheriff is not the same thing as a randomly fired gun or broken dentures. Governor McNutt, whose approval allowed Dillinger out on parole, took his escape and the resulting crime spree very seriously. Immediately after the escape, Dillinger and the gang not only raided a police station, but a couple of police stations, taking all the guns with them. So the governor ordered Leach to form a special squad of 6 police officers for the sole purpose of tracking down Dillinger and his accomplices. He also beefed up security at the state's armories with 700 members of the Indiana National Guard. Indiana prisons had also begun boosting their defenses. Fort Wayne and Indianapolis built steel cages inside prisons for added protection. They started installing metal bars in the windows of police stations. Indianapolis purchased armored cars with machine guns for police officers. Police stations started to be fortified almost everywhere. The Central National Bank in Greencastle, Indiana, was also concerned about security. But on Monday, October 23rd, a guard who was supposed to be in a protective booth went into the basement. Right then, Dillinger, Pierpont, and Mackley entered the bank while Clark stood watch outside. The robbery took exactly 5 minutes. Mackley checked with a stopwatch, and Dillinger kindly left a wad of money for a farmer who had not had time to deposit it. The residents of Greencastle were delighted with the style of robbery. After all, the bandits didn't kill anyone and even left some cash behind. But the reaction of the bank owner aroused suspicion. "We're not seeking any publicity in connection with Mr. Dillinger's crime," said the director. Suspicions arose of cooperation between the robbers and the banks. A 1933 law, part of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, protected depositors but not banks. Banks were only protected from theft if they had private insurance, which was exactly what Greencastle Bank had. Since many banks were failing at the time, getting robbed for an unknown amount was not such an unwelcome event. That Dillinger's business was a setup has not been established for certain, but the vague statements as to the exact amount stolen, as well as the desire to hush up the case as soon as possible, were highly suspicious. At any rate, this stunt brought the gang its biggest jackpot of all: $75,000 in cash and bonds. The public was of two minds about the uproar raised by John Dillinger. Although the death of the sheriff in Lima had only recently occurred, the event was quickly forgotten. The idea had circulated that Dillinger was actually a kind of Robin Hood, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. He didn't really give to the poor, but his spectacular escapes, risky deeds, and chivalrous behavior gave him such an angelic rep. Part of the Dillinger myth had to do with the public's distaste for banks. At the height of the Great Depression, when unemployment was high and most Americans were living in poverty, bankers were clearly disfavored. They were accused of foreclosing on homes and farms, and every bank robbery was seen justifiably as a painful poke into the side of those vultures. Although Dillinger and his partners were labeled a terrorist gang, bank robberies seemed acceptable to the public as long as no one was killed. But in addition to the public and the police, federal authorities began to take notice of Dillinger. In his book, Public Enemies, Brian Burrow argues that the war on robbers began with the Kansas City Massacre of June 1933. The bloodbath at the city's train station was an attempt by criminals to free a prisoner who had been taken from Hot Springs to the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth. Inmate Frank "Jelly" Nash was killed in the shootout, along with 3 local police officers and an FBI agent. The Kansas City murders drew the Federal Bureau into a war against robbers. However, with only 250 special agents and 60 accountants, the Bureau was mainly in the business of gathering information. Agents were not authorized to arrest suspects, much less carry weapons. In promoting the Empowerment Act, J. Edgar Hoover decided that catching Dillinger would be a status event for the Bureau, but he took his time. His goal was to create a new type of law enforcement agency in the United States, so a positive public image was crucial, and the far-sighted Hoover never involved the Bureau unless the odds of success were above average. With respect to the Dillinger gang, Hoover had so far given limited authorization to the Bureau's Cincinnati field office to assist Indiana police. It was late October 1933, and the Dillinger gang now had a base in Chicago. With their malls, the group had decided that the Windy City was the safest place in America. Chicago was notorious for crime and corruption. Here, they could easily sell stolen bonds and jewelry, pay for protection, and make connections with other crooks. Besides, in the big city, their excessive lifestyle was not as noticeable. They dressed stylishly, lived in comfortable apartments, and frequented upscale restaurants. For entertainment, they went to sporting events, movies, and drove around their new cars. But as the saying goes, it was business as usual. Robbers also could not forget their work, out of the ordinary as it was, and on November 20th, 1933, the gang made one of the most spectacular bank raids in its history, 100 miles north of Chicago in Racine, Wisconsin. The robbery of the U.S. Bank and Trust Company in Racine was flawlessly planned. The details of the robbery, from the dialogue to the actions, became a classic and were often repeated in the movies. The gang's preparatory work consisted of thoroughly inspecting the bank over several days. Then blueprints of the bank's floors were drawn, and the expected number of customers and employees was noted. Careful plans for the escape were made and laid out in minute detail, both in time and distance. A black Buick Auburn with folding seats and bright yellow wire wheels was chosen for the escape. At the wheel was a mysterious new recruit in charge of leading an experimental labor system. The driver of the Buick drove past the bank twice, each time dropping off 2 men to attract less attention. He then parked the vehicle behind the building, leaving the engine running. The 4 outlaws, dressed in stylish suits, hats, and coats that safely concealed their Thompsons, entered the bank in pairs through the main street entrance. Pierpont carried large rolls of paper under his arm, 2 Red Cross posters that he would hang on the glass sashes of the doors. The posters blocked almost the entire view from the street. Dillinger and Mackley walked over to the cashier's booths, and Russell Clark took a seat at the entrance. The head cashier, Harold Graham, had turned away and was counting coins when Mackley approached his closed window and said, "Hands up." An irritated Graham thought it was a joke and paid no attention, which earned him a shot in the arm from a Thompson, but he managed to press the button to call the cops. Mackley, on the other hand, went in and took all the money in the teller's possession. Dillinger, meanwhile, dealt with the vault, convincing the bank's president, Grover Wyland, and his junior deputy, Lauren Brown, to open it. When they succeeded and the bandits began taking the contents, another teller pressed a different panic button, setting off an alarm. As it rang, police officers Hanson and Boyard arrived. True, it was not to the call of a robbery. The malfunctioning alarm had been plaguing them for weeks, so they were in no particular hurry. Unaware of the danger, Officer Boyard was the first to enter the bank, immediately turning into one of the hostages. Hanson, who entered second with a Thompson in his hand, was less fortunate. Mackley fired several bullets at him, severely wounding the officer. Having cleaned out the bank, the bandits took the hostages and headed away. There was already a crowd outside the bank, as there always was during robberies, giving the intruders an additional shield because the police were afraid of hurting the onlookers. In the crowd stood 2 local detectives who were armed but could do nothing, both because of the crowd and because of Mackley, who was firing his Tommy gun at the walls to advance towards the Buick. On reaching the automobile, the gang dived inside the cabin, and the 4 hostages were ordered to stand on the running boards. The Buick started up and gradually began to pick up speed. Along the way, a couple of the hostages were ordered to jump off so they could go faster, and the remaining hostages, a girl and the bank's director, were put inside. An hour after leaving town, the Buick turned onto a secluded road, found a quiet spot, and pulled over. Pierpont ordered the director and the girl to follow him into the woods, where he tied the frightened hostages by the arms on either side of a thick tree and told them to wait exactly half an hour. After that time, they untied themselves without difficulty and walked out into a field, where they were picked up by a local farmer and taken to the police. The attention John attracted with this robbery led Hoover to brand Dillinger as public enemy number one. In the meantime, John and several members of his gang decided to take a vacation. On December 14, 1933, 3 luxury cars carrying 5 men and 4 women drove from freezing Chicago to sunny Florida. For the gang, after an endless string of confrontations, shootings, and robberies over the past 6 months, this vacation in the sun seemed like paradise. They were finally able to relax and have fun. They swam, sunbathed, fished, and even traveled to Miami for an air race, despite the fact that authorities were looking for them there due to a tip from Leach before they even visited the city. It was very typical in Dillinger's case, who seemed to be spotted everywhere back then. The Chicago Tribune even ran a sarcastic article at the time, reporting that Dillinger had been seen from Canada to Mexico and all points in between, including while buying a house in Indiana and a fishing rod in New York. While it would seem that John has been in the spotlight more than any other person in the history of crime, figuring out where he was or what exactly happened on certain days is difficult. And the most controversial episode in Dillinger's life, aside from his death, was without a doubt the robbery of the First National Bank in East Chicago on January 15, 1934. The reason for the controversy in this case lies in that for the first time, John was personally charged with the murder of a policeman. And this was the point of no return for the bandit because police officers did not forgive. He told his family that he was not involved in the shooting, but allegedly admitted it to his lawyer. Combining all the data on the case from the East Chicago Bank, it turns out that between January 1st and 14th, 1934, Dillinger returned to Chicago from Florida with Hamilton. However, Dillinger was seen in both Chicago and Florida at this time, adding to the confusion. But assuming he was at this bank after all, the story emerged as follows. Dillinger arrived with Hamilton at the bank around 3 p.m. on Monday, January 15th. A third party, an unidentified driver, was outside in a running car. What happened next followed a classic pattern. Dillinger's gentlemanly banter, money left behind for those customers who didn't have time to deposit it, the employee who pressed the panic button, and the police arriving. The first person to enter was disarmed by Dillinger. The others decided to wait outside. Dillinger and Hamilton started to leave the bank, pushing forward 2 hostages, one of which was a policeman. Outside, there was a crowd again. Everyone watched breathless as the 2 thugs walked toward the car. And when they were already at the car, the hidden policeman O'Malley shouted something to his colleague, who was next to Dillinger. The policeman jerked, giving O'Malley a chance to shoot, and Dillinger was hit in the chest by 4 bullets. The bulletproof vest held back the impact, but an enraged John fired a line of bullets at O'Malley. The cop was hit by 8 bullets. By the time O'Malley hit the pavement, he was dead. Meanwhile, Hamilton also took a number of shots, 7 of which his body armor could not deflect. Dillinger forced the wounded man into the car, and the driver immediately drove them off to an unknown destination. The car was found the next day in Chicago. It was riddled with bullets that had been flung at the robbers, and the seats were soaked with the blood of the badly wounded Hamilton. Dillinger had to turn to an underground Chicago doctor, who charged $5,000 for Hamilton's treatment. He survived, and a little later his family took him to Indiana. So Dillinger, a witty gentleman bank robber with a charming, crooked smile, became a cop killer. He always denied his presence that day in East Chicago and the murder of O'Malley. In a way, the beautiful legend that Dillinger was a poor guy robbing rich banks without harming ordinary people had gotten a deep crack in it. Many citizens now saw the Mooresville native in a different light. After the East Chicago bank deal, Dillinger changed. Though he denied the murder, the episode seemed to weigh on him. He began to take fewer risks and to take life more seriously. He once said that, "Every man has the right to defend himself," as if he was trying to justify it. The rest of the gang was away from Chicago at this time. Mackley, Pierpont, Clark, and their friends left Florida in early January and arrived in Tucson, Arizona a week later. Feeling at ease, Clark and Mackley started drinking and talking too much. At their posh hotel in the early morning hours of January 22nd, a fire broke out. Firefighters arriving on the scene were surprised by the two men's request to remove suitcases of valuables from their room. They were further surprised by the weight of the suitcases. They were filled with ammunition and money, and they were completely taken aback when the men gave them $50 for the job. The next day, these firemen identified Clark and Mackley in a detective magazine they were reading on their breaks. Finding the two fancy car-driving dudes in that small town was not hard. By January 25th, the police began following Mackley, and he was arrested without resistance in a store while buying a police radio. Clark was tracked a little longer and found in a rented house on the outskirts of town. Under the guise of a mailman, the police entered the house, where Clark put up a desperate resistance and could only be subdued by a blow to the head with a rifle butt. A whole arsenal was taken from the house, packed in suitcases. Pierpont was next. Handsome Harry, unaware that his comrades were being picked off one by one, was also being watched. His girlfriend, Mary Kinder, was the one who came to him. She had driven to Clark's house and, seeing the blood and disorder, quickly fled the scene. But a vigilant neighbor remembered her license plate number. Handsome Harry and Mary attempted to drive out of Tucson, but the police stopped them for a minor traffic violation and not having a tourist sticker on their windshield. It was cause enough for them to be taken to the station, where they were of course detained. One of the guns found turned out to be the weapon used to kill Sheriff Sarber in Lima. How the gang communicated with each other was still a mystery to investigators. It's most probable that the house where Clark was taken was the designated meeting place, and when Dillinger and Frechette drove into Tucson, they did not yet know that all their friends had been captured, as they went straight to Clark's house. Inside, two policemen were waiting for them, with a third watching from the street. Leaving Frechette in the car with a puppy, Dillinger approached the house, and, like Mary Kinder, immediately noticed there had been a fight. He instantly turned around and went to his car, but got confronted by a police officer and detained. In the cop's car, he said, "I will be a laughingstock in court. Could I have thought I would be captured by the police of some backwater town?" Frechette and her puppy were also arrested that night. In less than a week, the Tucson Police Department had done what no law enforcement, no bank security, no private investigators, not even the Dillinger-obsessed Leach and his Indiana State Police could do. In addition, the items found in Dillinger's possession were no less valuable than the fact of his arrest itself. He had a gun and $2,000 on him. The FBI traced several $5 bills, and they were registered to an East Chicago bank. A major lead was found, and the gang was transferred from the Tucson City Jail to the county jail. 3 states, Indiana, Ohio, and Wisconsin, sent teams of attorneys and lawyers to seek the extradition of the suspects. Indiana wanted Dillinger for an alleged robbery in East Chicago and the shooting of O'Malley. Wisconsin for a robbery in Racine, and Ohio authorities were looking for Pierpont, Mackley, and Clark for the alleged murder of Sarber. The day after the capture, a grand jury in East Chicago, Indiana, agreed that there was enough evidence to indict Dillinger for O'Malley's murder. Several eyewitnesses testified to the grand jury about the shooting. Realizing that the charges against him carried the death penalty, Dillinger wanted to go to Wisconsin. The death penalty was not practiced there, and he was only charged with robbing the Racine bank, not murder. On January 29th, however, he did go to Indiana. To prevent attempts to rescue Dillinger upon his arrival in Chicago, the authorities took unprecedented measures. More than 30 Chicago police officers wearing bulletproof vests and carrying a variety of weapons from pistols to assault rifles, awaited the arrival of the plane carrying Dillinger at Midway Airport on January 30th. 60 more officers were on duty to maintain order at the airport. Indiana's famous outlaw fully lived up to his stellar reputation. The lights and camera flashes made the night seem like day. There was an eerie hum created by members of the press. At the center of this frenzy was Dillinger himself, handcuffed to a county sheriff's deputy. This frenzy, which peaked with Dillinger's press conference, not only added a lot of points to John's publicity, but also affected the fates of the two lawmen who were supposed to be dealing with him at the time. These were Sheriff Lillian Hawley and prosecuting attorney Robert Estill. Indiana's only female sheriff, Hawley, inherited the position when her husband was killed in a shooting a year earlier. Hawley's duties included overseeing the Lake County Jail at Crown Point, where Dillinger was being escorted. The second official, Estill, was a man in his 50s. He traveled to Arizona to lobby for Dillinger's return to his jurisdiction. It was Estill who authorized a press conference with the prisoner, which was a complete media and reputational failure for the authorities. Dillinger immediately unleashed the full avalanche of his dark charm onto the ravenous press. 30 reporters impatiently squeezed into a room in the Lake County Jail. There were about 500 spectators outside. This press conference likely set the final tone for what later became the legend of Dillinger as a celebrity. And here, Estill made a decision that he regretted for the rest of his life, posing with his captive. A few minutes of photo ops before the interview undermined any political ambitions for the Lake County prosecutor. A Chicago photographer asked Estill to hug Dillinger. Surprisingly, he did. Dillinger then put his hand on Estill's shoulder. You can't paint a better buddy illustration than that. And in one of the photos, Dillinger has his palm folded in the shape of a gun. 3 fingers bent, index finger pointing downward, and thumb looking like the trigger. It was later speculated that this was a signal to his friends on the outside to send a gun to prison, as he himself had once done. Lillian Hawley was also noted in this legendary photo. The arrested most wanted man sparklingly answered questions from the press. When asked where his hat was, Dillinger said it was stolen in Tucson along with his money. Playing up the image of a victim and a good guy caught in a bind, he told the story of the slacker who led him to a life of crime. He claimed he was not a threat to society. In Mooresville, I was just a poor boy, he shrugged. Regarding helping his 10 buddies escape from the Michigan City pen, he said, I met a lot of good guys there. I wanted to help them. Why not? I stick by my friends and they stick by me. When asked, how long does it take to rob a bank, Dillinger answered sarcastically, exactly 1 minute and 40 seconds. Although he never wasted any time in a bank, it certainly sounded boastful. Oddly enough, Estill and Hawley didn't stop this interview, even though Dillinger was getting more brazen and talking more every minute. In general, he told about his hard criminal life in Chicago, escapes, shootings, and he did not forget to mention his driving skills. He even told how the gang moved from neighborhood to neighborhood and from house to house for conspiracy purposes, but of course without giving details. Dillinger didn't forget to go over the stupidity of Charles Mackley and Russell Clark in Arizona either. They trusted the firefighters too much to return the suitcases. If the firemen had only made a couple of bucks, we'd be safe and happy, he concluded. It seemed as if the interview would never end. Topics changed one after another, from cartoons to the President of the United States. Dillinger shared that The 3 Little Pigs is one of his favorite cartoons and that he supported Franklin D. Roosevelt and his Bank Recovery Act. Commenting on his personal habits, Dillinger revealed that he drank and smoked very little. I suppose my only bad habit was robbing banks. One hot topic that Dillinger took a defensive stance on was the alleged murder of Sergeant William O'Malley in East Chicago. Knowing full well that this was his most dangerous charge, he flatly denied it. He explained the marked bills found in his possession by saying that they'd been given to him from Hamilton and he intended to deliver them to his children. When the evening finally came to a close, Dillinger concluded his exchange with the press with a charming summary. "You see, folks, I'm not such a bad guy at heart. I'm trying to be good." Just in case, he added, "I like Mr. Estelle, and Mrs. Hawley seems like a fine lady." On this positive note, he was led off to his cell. Dillinger had clearly charmed the press and enjoyed himself immensely. Articles published the next day called him suave and eloquent. He was relaxed and had a sense of humor, spoke well, and even expressed sincere sympathy. It was not a ruthless killer who had appeared before the public like many would expect. One newspaper reported that the half-hour interview made Dillinger look like the kindest man who'd ever robbed a bank. Even the New York Times gave positive reviews of Dillinger's interview. The Crown Point press conference allowed Dillinger to show for the first time that he was human too. His story of how he'd been a foolish boy who had fallen under the influence of hardened criminals in prison and then made a great success of robbing banks and living in luxury was being quoted. Within 24 hours of the interview, Dillinger had transformed himself from an average crook to a smart, shining celebrity. Meanwhile, while Dillinger was basking in his fame, the status of his 3 accused accomplices in Arizona was decided. On January 29th, the 4 prisoners, Pierpont, Clark, Mackley, and Mary Kinder, were put on a train with Detective Leach. 150,000 Tucson residents gathered outside the station as the train departed. 2 days later, they arrived in Chicago. Now that Pierpont, Mackley, and Clark were back behind bars, all eyes were turned again to Dillinger, whose escape could not be allowed. He was under 24-hour surveillance, and the police officer on duty kept a machine gun pointed at Dillinger. There were 6 steel doors between the prisoner and the outer block. As an extra precaution, Hawley stayed up most of the night, armed and loaded. The perimeter of the prison was patrolled by guards, armed volunteers, and the Indiana National Guard, carrying Browning automatic rifles capable of ejecting 120 bullets per minute and piercing body armor. The day after his arrival on January 31st, Dillinger hired Chicago attorney Louis Paquette. The 2 men met and built a simple folded line of defense. Although several witnesses identified Dillinger as the shooter, Paquette maintained that his client was not in East Chicago. In fact, when O'Malley was killed, Dillinger was vacationing in Florida. However, John didn't really want to wait for the court's decision and wanted to decide his own fate. Dillinger came up with a plan to escape from Crown Point Prison, bringing him even more fame and finally cementing his status as a legend of the crime world. This escape, which took place on March 3, 1934, is still the subject of lively debate. The conflict centers on whether Dillinger escaped from prison on his own or whether he had help. At the center of the plan and debates was a weapon. But what kind of weapon was it? Version 1 suggests it was a real gun smuggled in. But someone had to have smuggled it in, right? Only Paquette the attorney and Frechette, who was searched by Hawley, had access to Dillinger. Both Paquette and Frechette were suspected, and even Sheriff Hawley. The second theory, the most famous, is that Dillinger made the gun himself. According to John, it was made out of wood from a washboard, painted black with shoe polish, and with inserts of old razor blades to give the gun a realistic look. The fake gun had no grip and was therefore difficult to hold. The weapon became the subject of both folklore and fierce controversy. Did Dillinger really design it? Was it made of wood or soap? There's speculation that the fake was made by an expert on the outside, and Frechette or Paquette carried it into the prison. After all, how could John, who was under guard 24 hours a day, make a fake and paint it with tar? And so well that even experienced guards couldn't tell the difference. There is a version with 2 pistols, one real and one fake. Some bribed employees came with a real gun and handed it in, and the wooden one was delivered and left with Dillinger. Either way, whether the gun was real or not didn't make much difference to what happened next. After a month of intense shifts, those guarding Dillinger at Crown Point Prison were exhausted. 24-hour shifts had come to a halt. On the morning of March 3rd, an elderly prison worker named Cahoon and 2 assistants entered a large gym on the second floor of the prison. They were to deliver soap and supplies for Saturday night bathing to 14 inmates, including Dillinger in the prison cell block. Unfortunately, the worker and his assistants did not check that the prisoners were locked in before entering the prison cell block. Soon, the old man felt something like a gun against his back. Dillinger ordered 2 workers into the cells. Behind him stood his cellmate, Herbert Youngblood, a 6.5-foot tall African-American man on death row for first-degree murder. Dillinger's plan was simple. He would walk the hallways, locking any officers he encountered in a cell. There was no need to disarm them, which was both a plus and a minus. The guards had surrendered their weapons for the duration of their shift, and Dillinger knew only vaguely where they were stored. It appeared that he had studied the layout of the prison beforehand, as he moved through the maze of stairs and corridors with great confidence. They reached the long passage between the blocks without difficulty and saw a fingerprint examiner named Blank. On John's orders, Cahoon called out to Blank, and the latter walked toward him and saw Dillinger around the corner. The sluggish Cahoon was replaced by Blank, and the fugitives moved forward to the office of Chief Warden Baker, an experienced jailer who was the only one who posed any real danger. Blank lured Baker to the stairs, where from around a corner, Dillinger grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and put a gun to his back. That's how Baker ended up in a cell with the prisoners, telling Dillinger where the guns and cars were. Traveling further down the corridors of the prison, Dillinger and Youngblood captured guards 2 and 3 at a time. First of all, this was because on Saturday morning there were fewer guards on duty, and secondly, many of the guards were simply asleep after the previous night's libations. Only one of the guards was armed with a blackjack, a long leather-covered rod, and he claimed for the rest of his life that Dillinger's gun was real. That's why he surrendered without a fight. His words were corroborated by Blank. So, Dillinger, Youngblood, and Blank descended from the second floor to the first floor. They left behind them 6 guards, 13 prisoners, and the warden locked up. The next encounter in the hallway proved successful. They disarmed an Indiana National Guardsman. Now, it didn't matter whether Dillinger had a dummy gun or not. From that moment on, his gun was real. When he finally reached the office, he found 2 Tommy guns laying peacefully on the windowsill, which he also took. Dillinger collected cash from the locked guards, and before he left, he was said to have laughed and slammed a wooden pistol against the metal bars of the cell, boastfully saying, "That's how tough your prison is. I did it all with my little toy gun." Dillinger's escape plan was to go through the back of the prison building and out into the courtyard. To do so, he needed to get into the kitchen unit, which he thought was accessed by a door from the second-floor jail unit. It turned out that there was no door, and they had to walk down the long corridor again. Finally, the kitchen was found. A cook and 2 guards were there. Dillinger took them along and put on a cloak he found in the kitchen pantry. The next step was a garage, but none of the cars had keys, and so Blank took them to another garage that was already outside the prison. The bandits needed to go out the back gate into an alley and across the street, which they did without facing any obstacles. There, Dillinger chose a Ford V8, and behind the wheel, he put the suffering Blank, who a few minutes later reported that Dillinger had unintentionally stolen the car of Lillian Hawley herself. The fugitives met no challenges on their way out of town, and the authorities learned of the escape after they were far enough away. John released the hostages far from large population centers with a telephone message. In the afternoon, the stunning escape was discussed in detail on every radio station from coast to coast, and Dillinger's name was plastered on every newspaper across the country. And while all the states clung to their receivers waiting for more details, Indiana was looking for a scapegoat. Robert Estill's political career became a crashing ruin, and Lillian Hawley became a target for sexist attacks. There was a panic in the banking industry. Dillinger was free and needed money. No one doubted that he would try to remedy his plight as soon as possible. Every bank in the country was placed under a state of emergency. The National Guard arrived at the Michigan City prison. John Dillinger's name was whispered in awe, and Pierpont, Mackley, and Clark became almost demigods as they awaited their imminent release. Reports of the ghostly Dillinger came from all over the country. He had been seen in Ohio, in Buffalo, New York, in Florida, in Texas, Michigan, Missouri, Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. And that's where nationwide publicity following the escape finally raised Dillinger's media profile to a level that made him of interest to what we now know as the FBI. Within a week of the escape, Bureau Director Hoover finally began a serious hunt for Dillinger. While Holly and Estelle were getting crucified, no one paid attention to his lawyer, Paquette. But it was at his office that the real Dillinger appeared, spotted by a vigilant Chicago detective, yet that message was drowned in a flood of false information. At their meeting, Paquette gave Dillinger $300 and told him where to find Billy Frechette. John picked her up, then dropped Youngblood off, gave him $100 and left town. A few weeks later, Youngblood was killed in a shootout in Michigan. Dillinger and Frechette, on the other hand, traveled to Minnesota, arriving in the city of St. Paul a day and a half after fleeing Crown Point. There, the couple rented an apartment and soon got back to work. Dillinger quickly put together a new gang by scouring old contacts. It included an old friend, Homer Van Meter, as well as Tommy Carroll, Eddie Green, and Lester Gillis, who was better known as George Babyface Nelson. Nelson got the offensive nickname because of his chubby, blushed baby cheeks, and it was in stark contrast to his personality. He was hot-tempered, violent, and completely unpredictable. The day Dillinger arrived in Minnesota, Nelson killed a man who cut him off while driving on a highway. Nelson tracked down the man who was traveling with his family, got out of his car, and shot him dead. This second Dillinger gang, as it was dubbed in the newspapers, wasted no time. At 9:30 a.m. on March 6, 1934, the new gang drove into Sioux Falls, South Dakota, located several hundred miles west of St. Paul. That day, a recuperating John Hamilton got involved. 6 bandits were in on the robbery. 2 stood at the entrance to the bank and 4 went inside. The guard reacted instantly and pressed the panic button, which angered one of the gang, probably Babyface. He jumped on the counter, began screaming frantically, and spotting a cop in the window, fired a line at him. The officer was badly hurt but survived. The gang didn't invent anything new to get away either. They advanced towards the car, surrounding themselves with 5 hostages. During the escape, a fierce shootout with the police ensued, but the robbers had heavier firepower and the guards quickly fell behind. A few miles out of town, the bandits moved into an old Chevy, hauled their belongings into it, released the hostages, and after changing cars a couple of times along the way, successfully broke away from the pursuit, which was then being accompanied by airplanes. When the news from Sioux Falls first reached the public, no one believed it, and a little later the then-famous comedian Will Rogers commented on the episode, referring to the operation of the police in Chicago, not in Sioux Falls. They surrounded Dillinger in Chicago, but that day he robbed a bank in Sioux Falls, so they were right on his trail, just 3 states wrong. Hoover and Roosevelt saw nothing funny in what was happening in the Midwest. And after the Sioux Falls robbery, Melvin Purvis, head of the Bureau's Chicago office, took over the Dillinger case. Beginning in March 1934, and for the next 4 months, the lives of Dillinger and Purvis became intertwined. However, they never saw each other face to face until the night of Dillinger's death. Purvis was only 30 years old when Hoover called on the special agent to head the Dillinger investigation in Chicago. When he joined the Bureau in 1926, Purvis fit the profile of Hoover's model agent perfectly. He was a Southerner, well-educated, neatly groomed, handsome, wealthy, and white. Purvis was probably ill-prepared for the task he was assigned. In truth, he lacked the basic police training necessary to deal with a criminal of Dillinger's caliber. In addition, Purvis had no contacts or informants in the crime world. Still, Hoover trusted him, and on March 12th, the Bureau issued its first wanted notice for Dillinger. The chase was on. And while John was frolicking at will, the fate of his friends, whom he had not yet given up the hope of freeing, was being decided. On March 11th, after a 3-day trial, Pierpont was unanimously found guilty of first-degree murder. The same verdict went to Mackley. The electric chair awaited them both. Clark, on the other hand, received a life sentence. Dillinger's next victim was the First National Bank in Mason City, Iowa. It had an impressive $240,000 in cash reserves, and it was located in a small town of 25,000 people 23 miles south of the Minnesota border. A couple days before the case, Green and Van Meter, disguised as salesmen, went to the home of Fisher, the assistant cashier. They needed to know him by sight because Fisher knew the codes to the vaults. Then Dillinger, Carroll, Hamilton, Chase, and Nelson arrived. They loaded into a Buick stolen the day before and drove off to rob the bank. The car stopped at 2:20 p.m. in the back. Chase stayed in, and the others got out, on the way scaring a cameraman that was shooting a film about small-town life. The thing is that on the inside, things didn't go according to plan. First, Fisher had managed to lock himself in a room where he could not be reached, so it was impossible to get into the vault. And secondly, there was a real watchtower which they hadn't noticed before that had a great view of the lobby. It even had holes for throwing tear gas and rifle slots. A guard who ran in immediately fired a gas shell, to which an enraged Green fired a line of Tommy gun bullets into the tower. The guard was wounded and incapacitated, giving the bandits time. Gas, however, was slowly filling the room, with people crying and coughing on all sides. It wasn't calm outside either. Nelson was on a rampage out there, shooting everything and everyone around him with a machine gun. The robbery was getting out of hand and attracting the attention of more and more cops and onlookers. After a few minutes, the ordinary citizens of the town joined the gunfight, one wounding Dillinger in the shoulder and another hitting Hamilton. John decided to give the order to head out. Escape came and went without excesses, and the wounds were not serious, but because they never made it to the vault, the loot amounted to only $52,000. On Thursday, March 15th, Dillinger returned to Chicago. He met with Paquette's assistant, Arthur O'Leary, and asked him to find a skillful plastic surgeon who could keep silent. He was under increasing pressure from the authorities, and surgery was one of the few ways to alleviate that pressure. He was convinced he had made the right decision a few days after this request, when he almost got caught. He'd been tipped off by the landlady of the apartment he and Frechette were renting. FBI agents came to check out the tip and had a fierce gunfight with Dillinger and Van Meter. They managed to get away, but John was wounded again, this time in the leg, and many personal belongings were left behind in the apartment. These items proved to be very valuable to the Bureau. First, they were able to identify the couple through fingerprints. Second, a roadmap was found with exact directions on how to get to St. Paul from Iowa, bypassing the cities. Law enforcement finally realized the uselessness of roadblocks on major highways. But the most important find was a map with an exit plan from a bank in Newton, Iowa, which included the phone number of Eddie Green, the man they were going to hide out with, and the one they were on their way to go see. After reaching Green, they went to see a doctor, who was promised $500 for Dillinger's treatment, and while he was recovering, Green helped John at the cost of his own life. Agents who arrived at his door shot Green in front of his wife Bessie. Green lay unconscious in the hospital for a week. In his delirium, he leaked a lot of valuable information. He gave the names of doctors who treated Dillinger and Hamilton, their addresses, as well as the components of the gang that robbed banks in Sioux Falls and Mason City. Green also reported that Dillinger was considering plastic surgery. A squad was later sent to Dillinger's nursing home address. Authorities had the correct address number, but they had the wrong apartment. It was Dillinger's luck. He managed to slip away again. March 1934 was a busy month for Dillinger, to say the least. He escaped from prison, robbed 2 banks, and was involved in a shootout with federal agents and was wounded twice. The public continued to see him as untouchable by the authorities, and the legend of John Dillinger fleshed out in incredible detail. The authorities, from federal to local, seemed incapable of making a single good decision. Then, April came. Hoover decided to raise the stakes and start playing seriously. In early April 1934, he sent 50 agents to St. Paul and Minneapolis under the direction of 2 of his aides. Using the phrase, "war on crime," Hoover went after not only Dillinger but also Babyface Nelson, Pretty Boy Floyd, the Ma Barker Gang, and Bonnie and Clyde. Even despite this and the constant surveillance of his father's house, Dillinger managed to attend a family reunion on April 8th, where almost all of the immediate family was gathered. It was on this day that another famous photograph of Dillinger was taken. Standing outside the house, he held a machine gun in one hand and the wooden Crown Point pistol in the other. Lunch and his subsequent departure occurred without incident. Dillinger was lucky again because a couple of hours later, 14 federal agents were there, searching the farm. On April 9th, Dillinger and Frechette arrived in Chicago and arranged to meet their lawyer at a downtown bar. Frechette was the first to go in the bar and inspect, and was arrested by FBI agents who were already waiting for them. They did not see Dillinger in the car, and since he could do nothing to help his lover, John drove away, later asking Paquette to defend Frechette in court. Bureau agents took Frechette to their office. There are reports that her interrogation was rough and brutal. But she never broke down, and the Bureau was unable to get any information from her. She was eventually given 2 years in prison. Dillinger, of course, was very upset by the arrest of his ride or die. Now added to the constant thoughts of freeing his friends in Ohio was his concern for Frechette. He had planned to free her when he was transferred to St. Paul, but after calculating the odds, he realized it wouldn't work. He didn't have the resources for a big shootout. After spending some time in Chicago, Dillinger's gang decided they needed to cool off a bit and recover from their wounds. So they retired to the Little Bohemia Lodge, tucked away in the wilds of Wisconsin. Opened in 1930, the Little Bohemia was a 2-story building with a dining hall, bar, kitchen, and a large area with a fireplace on the first floor. Rooms were located on the second floor. Behind the main building was a row of small cottages. The lodge was an ideal retreat for the bandits, as it was set back from the road and completely hidden in a dense wood. The company consisted of Van Meter, Dillinger, Hamilton, Carroll, Nelson, and their girlfriends. Dillinger and the Hamilton couple lodged in the main building. The rest settled in the cabins. The resort's owner, whose name was Emil Manatka, soon realized who his guests really were and bluntly asked Dillinger if their stay would be peaceful. John assured him that it would be. Manatka assured him that he would not report them, but he lied and almost immediately called his relatives and asked them to contact the authorities. When the message reached the FBI, they decided not to delay and scheduled their attack for the evening of the same day. The agents planned to surround the cabin on 3 sides and push the bandits to the lake right behind the recreation center. However, things did not go according to plan from the start. First, they mistook ordinary visitors for gang members and shot their car, killing one and seriously wounding the other. When the sound of gunfire was heard, Dillinger returned fire at the agents behind the trees and then jumped out of a second-story window. With Hamilton and Van Meter, he ran to the lake shore below the lodge. This altitude difference gave the bad guys a head start. Not knowing the terrain, Purvis and his men never saw the 3 escape. Outside the cabin, a gunfight had broken out as Nelson and Carroll returned fire at the agents. The bandits, however, quickly ceased firing and fled, disappearing into the darkness. The agents who ran after him became entangled in barbed wire, and several more fell into a drainage ditch. At that moment, Manatka appeared and mistakenly told Purvis that the criminals were still inside. Purvis decided to wait until dawn and then clear the building with tear gas. While they waited, Dillinger and his gang were already far away. John and company headed north, but not without action. Twice they were followed by local cops. Hamilton was shot again, and this time he didn't survive. He was buried near Chicago. The rest of the gang successfully left Little Bohemia. Dillinger again made fools of the authorities, but now the proud Hoover had also fallen in line with losers like Leach. During 2 weeks in April, Bureau agents had missed the almost guaranteed capture of Dillinger in St. Paul, as well as at a farm in Indiana. And now the Wisconsin operation had failed solely through the fault of Hoover's men. And Hoover was so confident of success that he recklessly announced to the press in the middle of the night that he had successfully surrounded the bandits. The Bureau looked even more foolish when it paid the Manatkas only $30 to repair the cars in the hotel, and the dealership where the agents rented the cars sued the federal government. Law enforcement was beginning to tire of Dillinger and the circus that accompanied him. When the dust settled, it wasn't just Purvis's career that was at stake. Hoover himself had been put in a predicament by the Little Bohemia affair. More than one politician in Washington already thought he should be fired or demoted. After Little Bohemia, Dillinger also caught the attention of the U.S. president. Roosevelt, who was in the first year of his New Deal program, hoped that federal and not local authorities could curb the nation's crime problems. When the crime bill was signed into law on May 18th, Roosevelt declared that his New Deal was designed to curb the villain, whoever that might be. The legislation gave the FBI 200 more agents. The government was concerned because there was growing public discontent. The Associated Press estimated that the government had spent $2 million chasing Dillinger after he had stolen less than a quarter of that amount. While the Little Bohemia escape was on everyone's lips, reporters got to the bottom of the second St. Paul escape as well. April was again the month when Dillinger managed to elude a host of law officers, adding to the veneer of his invincibility. On May 3, 1934, the gang went into action in Fostoria, Ohio. The loot was $15,000, and again, the robbery itself went awry, ending this time with casualties not only among the police, but civilians as well. 2 weeks later, on May 21st, Dillinger and Van Meter took a bank in north-central Ohio, this time in Galion, but only carried off about $5,000. Dillinger was recognized immediately after his trademark leap over the counter. The reason for the small gain was a change in the robbery plan. Banks were beginning to develop tactics against bandits, hiring more guards who understood what to do. So Dillinger just took the easy cash and didn't waste time in the vault. He still took his time, but many eyewitnesses noted Gentleman Johnny, with his smiles and jokes, was gone. Now everything went by quickly and without theatrics. John spent most of May in Chicago and northwest Indiana, busy thinking about the Billy Frechette trial in Minnesota and plastic surgery. His face had become too famous. He could no longer just pick up and walk down the street where his portrait was likely to be hung. To make matters worse, the governors of 5 Midwestern states had put a bounty on his head. Trusting no one but each other, John and Van Meter decided to take up residence in a red Ford truck. It contained 2 makeshift beds, and they spent some time at Crown Point Visitors Park, oddly enough. When later asked if he was afraid to return to the site of his famous jailbreak, Dillinger said Crown Point was the safest place in America for him. And he was right. No one was looking for him there. That's when he finally decided to have plastic surgery. Paquette found him a doctor who was willing to perform surgery on his face and a fingerprint removal for $5,000. Dillinger planned to remove 2 moles between the eyes, a small dent on the bridge of his nose, and a scar on his lip. Also included in the plan was a facelift, so the nationally famous dimple on his chin would disappear. The surgery was performed on the evening of May 28th. Anesthesia was administered by placing a towel over his face and dripping ether on it. Dillinger would not pass out, so the anesthesiologist started dripping more, causing the man to overdose. His tongue fell back and he stopped breathing. But the doctor was able to pump him out of it. The operation had to be carried out with local anesthesia, lasting 7 hours and causing Dillinger to lose a lot of blood. 5 days afterward, the doctor returned to remove fingerprints with hydrochloric acid, perform another surgery on Dillinger's face to remove the outstanding dimple on his chin, and perform surgery on Van Meter. At first, Dillinger was dissatisfied with the results, but when the swelling went down, for some reason he was convinced that he had become unrecognizable, although this was far from true. Back in Washington, Hoover decided that the Bureau had too many lawyers and accountants but no guys to work in the field. In early May, he began recruiting firearms experts from Texas, including a man named Charles Winstead, who we'll mention again. These men trained Hoover's agents and were also supposed to help if Dillinger was found. The involvement of influential and experienced lawmen meant only one thing. The authorities were fine with taking Dillinger alive or dead. He had eluded Hoover too many times and had done irreparable damage to the FBI's reputation. False tips about Dillinger's whereabouts had Purvis traveling around Indiana for the entire month of April for nothing, after which he got demoted and one of Hoover's top aides, Sam Cowley, was assigned to the Dillinger case and went to Chicago. Meanwhile, May turned into June, and Dillinger couldn't wait to hit the streets again. 3 days after his last facial makeover, he decided he was ready to rejoin society. Fellow criminals first saw Dillinger in a Chicago bar on June 5th. His face was puffy and wider than before the surgery. The recognizable features, moles and a dimple on his chin, were gone. The crooked smile remained, but the dark hair dye, sleek mustache, and glasses gave Dillinger a confidence that he was made unrecognizable. Those who knew the bandit's face well saw no difference in his appearance and wondered why he spent so much time in public. He repeatedly attended Chicago Cubs baseball games and was often confronted by Paquette, who was unimpressed with his client's new face and said that Dillinger would be wise to leave Wrigley Field immediately. Despite this, the visits to Wrigley continued. One day, Chicago detectives asked Paquette at the stadium when his famous client was going to turn himself in, with Dillinger sitting 20 feet away at the time. John spent the last few weeks of his life hiding in plain sight, enjoying his favorite pastimes of watching baseball and movies. On Monday, June 11th, he met Rita Hamilton, nicknamed Polly, who looked a lot like Frechette. 26-year-old Hamilton, originally from North Dakota and, like Frechette, of Native American descent, was a short girl with blue eyes and red hair. She worked as a waitress and moonlighted as a prostitute for a Romanian immigrant named Anna Sage, formerly known as Anna Campanas. In early July, Dillinger moved into Sage's Chicago apartment. He introduced himself as Jimmy Lawrence, an employee of the Chicago Chamber of Commerce. One of the major mysteries that remains is the connection between Dillinger and the East Chicago Police Department, and what Anna, Campanas Sage, in whose apartment Dillinger was staying, had to do with it all. There's intel that Sage's lover was Zarkovich, an East Chicago cop who served a couple years for taking bribes, one of Chicago's top corrupt cops. Most likely, Zarkovich was well aware of Dillinger's whereabouts and movements. That his girlfriend Sage introduced Dillinger to Frechette's double may not have been a coincidence either. It's obvious that Sage knew who Jimmy Lawrence really was, and it's not at all clear why John, who was always sensitive to danger, would trust this woman so much. So what were Dillinger's plans in June 1934? He always realized that he was engaged in a dangerous and violent business, but he clearly did not want to die. Paquette claimed that he planned to surrender with his help. According to other accounts, Dillinger intended to go to Mexico or even further south in Latin America. He He often told Frechette and later Hamilton that he wanted to settle down and start a family. The more famous he became, the fewer opportunities he had to successfully rob a bank, and the costs were mounting. In addition to his obligation to Pierpont and others in Ohio, the gang needed shelters, medical care, new guns, and wheelbarrows. The prices Dillinger and his friends paid for everything from cars to groceries were often exorbitant. Some of the crew took a risk fee. After all expenses were paid, there wasn't much left of their winnings, and by the end of June, the supplies were completely depleted. So, on the last day of June 1934, Dillinger and his gang found themselves in the town of South Bend in northern Indiana, in front of the Merchants National Bank on Michigan Street. In a way, it was this last Dillinger robbery that became a movie stamp. Shootouts, broken glass, bleeding comrades, and explosions. The robbers, the law officers, and the civilians all took a beating that day. Moreover, this time the citizens fired at the bandits just as much as the police did. Several cars and motorcycles rushed after the robbers. The bandits were throwing roofing nails and fiercely shooting back. One of the police cars overturned and exploded a little later. During the shootings, 6 townspeople were seriously injured and 1 police officer was killed. 2 of the gang were wounded and needed medical attention, so they retreated to Chicago as usual. After everyone was patched up, it turned out that what was taken amounted to just under $30,000. Not a lot considering the dead police officer, the wounded, and all the chaos they had caused. Bank robberies, or armed money grabs as some called them, were no longer an easy and lucrative endeavor. After this case, authorities added another $25,000 to the bounty on Dillinger, making it nearly $50 grand in total. And while state and federal officials were upping the ante for his capture, Dillinger was making his own plans. Inspired by the South Bend stunt, he and Van Meter intended to write a book or make a movie about their adventures. They even wanted to hire an experienced writer to help them. Oddly enough, the criminals chose the theme, "Crime is not redeemable." They believed that the book or movie would be their message to America's youth. Dillinger also wanted to pull off another major robbery, this time not of a bank, but a train. First of all, banks were getting harder to rob, and they weren't pulling in much money. Second, Dillinger was targeting millions, not tens of thousands, so he could retire and hide in another country. And while Dillinger cherished dreams of train robbery and a quiet, contented life, he had already been backstabbed 3 times. First, the plastic surgeon pondered the idea of approaching federal agents for a bounty, but got scared and didn't show up for a meeting with the agent. Next was Jimmy Probasco, at whose home Dillinger had surgery. Some speculate that the criminal's attorney, Louis Paquette, may have been involved in this betrayal scheme, as he and Probasco often drank together. Dillinger apparently considered this possible threat real enough that he set up a meeting with Paquette during the last week of July to discuss surrendering to authorities. He probably wanted to scare Paquette. The third snitch turned out to be the most serious. It was Saturday, July 21st. Purvis and his boss Callie had a meeting with some police informants who claimed to have an insider who knew exactly where John Dillinger was. It was Zarkovich and his buddy O'Neill. And the insider was, of course, Anna Sage. At 6 o'clock, 2 East Chicago cops were already laying out their scheme to the feds. Their female informant was ready to meet and give up Dillinger's exact whereabouts. Purvis and Callie readily agreed. At the meeting, Anna explained that in return, she wanted the reward promised for John and help with her issues with immigration. But Purvis only shrugged and said that the most she could expect for her information was a percentage of the reward and a letter of recommendation from him to Immigration Services. So for an unspecified sum and a letter guaranteeing nothing, Anna Sage gave up the man the whole government wanted so badly. John and Polly often went to the movies, usually to the Marlboro Theater. It was not uncommon to call her to go together, and they would probably be there that following Sunday as well. If the tip proved true, Anna promised to call Purvis. Sage called the very next day, informing him that they would be going to either the Biograph movie theater or the Marlboro. The Marlboro was showing a Shirley Temple movie, and the Biograph was showing a gangster flick with Clark Gable called Manhattan Melodrama. Agents had a hunch that Dillinger would choose the Biograph. Studying movie theater layouts, Purvis found 4 emergency exits in the Biograph and called in more men just in case. Their total number was now 30. They were all briefed on who would be with Dillinger, how they would identify them, where which agents would stand, and what they'd do. The briefing covered 2 movie theaters at once because most of the agents would stay in the office and wait for a call when it was clear where Dillinger would be. The signal for his capture was a cigarette being lit, either by Purvis, who would be in the Biograph, or by Officer Zarkovich, who would be in the Marlboro. By the way, Zarkovich and his men were there for a reason. They were suspected of having corrupt connections with John, and they'd practically asked for the case once they had brought in their informer, probably to see to it that the public enemy was not taken alive since no one knew what John might tell in the end. Dillinger chose the Biograph. The agents headed there so that John would bump into the authorities no matter which way he went. While Dillinger, his girlfriend Polly, and Anna Sage watched a movie, Purvis waited in the lobby to signal. He must have aged a few decades during those few hours of waiting. And Purvis also pestered the cashier about when the damn movie would end, causing her to call the police and almost derailing the operation. Agents dealt with the cops exactly at the moment of John's exit from the theater. At the same moment, a match went on, and Purvis's cigarette was lit. The agents rushed out of their seats looking for Dillinger in the crowd. Such activity did not go unnoticed by John. He looked around and saw more and more evidence of the ambush. Then he spotted what seemed to be an escapable alley where he rushed as soon as he spotted it, trying to get his gun at the same time. Along the way, he ran into a woman exiting the alley and turned slightly from the collision. At that point, agents opened fire. It's believed that the gunman who made the shot was Charles Winstead. One bullet penetrated Dillinger's chest at a sideways and downward angle and broke his left rib. The second slammed into the base of his neck and exited under his right eye. The impact of the shots combined with the collision with the lady spun Dillinger's body like a screw, and he began to fall, taking several more bullets in the process. Then, gathering his last strength, Dillinger got up and wandered into an alley, where he fell face down, shattering the lens of his glasses and breaking the brim of his straw hat. The .380 caliber Colt, still on the safety, remained in his hand. There was a long moment of eerie silence as Dillinger's blood could be heard pouring onto the pavement. Then, as if by a cue, the pandemonium began. Cars and streetcars stopped, and their passengers sped into the area. Pedestrians surrounded the fallen criminal. Within seconds, people were shouting the name Dillinger and running up to the body to dip a handkerchief in his blood. Special Agent Gillespie estimated that John Dillinger lived for about 3 minutes after the shooting. He was by his side when the famous crook awed and let out his last breath. Dillinger's body was first taken to the Alexian Brothers Hospital, where the doctor, observing formalities, issued a pronouncement of his death. The next stop for the corpse was the Cook County morgue. Federal fingerprint examiners were able to identify the perpetrator because the acid treatment on his hands had not worked. In his pockets, Dillinger had less than $10, 2 keys tied with a string, and a magazine clipping. Also on his person was a watch with a picture of Hamilton and a gold ruby ring with the words, "Love, Polly." That ring eventually went missing. Agents took the watch as evidence. The large amount of cash he allegedly had on him was never found. Zarkovich was accused of taking the money from Dillinger's body, but there's no proof of that accusation. The morgue was in chaos. The room was turned into an exhibition hall. Doctors, nurses, and nosy spectators were eager to take a look at the fallen America's Most Wanted man. Photographs were taken all night. An autopsy revealed the expected scars from bullet wounds, attempts to remove fingerprints, and stitches from plastic surgery. Before embalming began, a Chicago mortician hired by the family asked the coroner for permission to show the body. The body was tilted upright behind a glass window and covered with a sheet. Approximately 15,000 people saw Dillinger's corpse over the next few hours. They were from all walks of life. Businessmen and high school girls, politicians and housewives, well-dressed gangster types, and poorly dressed nightclub walkers. While some were eager to be photographed with the body, others cried or turned away just from seeing it. Hoover was surprisingly restrained about the event in Chicago, making it clear that other members of the Dillinger gang were still at large. Attorney General Cummings, however, was quick to give credit to the New Deal and the idea of a federal approach to fighting crime. The operation to capture Dillinger was marked by careful planning and scientific procedures. But in reality, neither Hoover's scientific methods nor Homer Cummings' vast government bureaucracy stopped Dillinger. It came down to an old-fashioned, yet often successful method of policing. Someone just ratted him out. While Hoover stayed in the background, Purvis became a star. The morning after the shooting, Hoover gave Purvis a promotion and a commending letter. Purvis turned into a national hero. On Monday morning, July 23rd, Dillinger's death was a front-page headline in every newspaper in the country. As the pictures started to appear, so did the process of shifting public opinion of Dillinger from folk hero to villain. The journalists wrote, "Dillinger got what he deserved." An inquest into Dillinger's death was held the day after the shooting. A federal agent doing work on the case testified at the hearing that Dillinger drew his weapon and was shot before he could get the weapon in a fighting position. The jury quickly reached a verdict of justifiable homicide. The fact that all of the bullet wounds on the body were from behind was not noted or explored. There was much speculation as to why there was no attempt to take Dillinger alive. After all, law enforcement had a large number of officers and the element of surprise on their side. Since it was rumored that some members of the East Chicago Police Department, particularly Zarkovich and his team, were drawing paychecks from Dillinger, they certainly didn't want him to talk. Two witnesses not called to the investigation told reporters that the agents got very close to Dillinger and shot him point blank in the back. Powder burns on the victim's clothing support this story. Can the shooting then be called a planned execution? This question is actually an interesting and debatable one, with enough arguments both for and against it. When John Sr. came to pick up his son's body, 5,000 Chicagoans gathered to watch the top-level criminal being taken away. Many people also gathered in Indianapolis, where the burial was to take place. John's family set a date for the burial and held it a day early to get away from unwanted gawkers, but it didn't help. A crowd still formed. And even a severe thunderstorm couldn't keep people from trying to witness the burial. Eventually, Dillinger was lowered into a grave in the cemetery where the President of the United States, 3 vice presidents, 2 Indiana governors, and several senators were laid to rest. To make sure the body would not be stolen, John Sr. filled the grave with concrete. Although no headstone was placed on Dillinger's grave for 2 years, when one did get placed, it was immediately taken in pieces by fans. Similarly, 2 more headstones were later destroyed. 6 weeks after Dillinger's death, his family performed on stage at the Lyric Theater in downtown Indianapolis, and later traveled the country to retell his story. Huge crowds eager to hear their stories paid 25 cents for matinee performances and 40 cents for evening performances. The theme was always, "Crime doesn't pay off." But it was obvious that most of the showgoers were there to hear about the crimes and the man who committed them. Dillinger's last visit to the Mooresville farm in April was the centerpiece of the show. Billy Frechette and other bandits sold their stories to newspapers and magazines. The Dillinger business was also lucrative for those who had souvenirs. These were often gruesome items from the final shootout, including handkerchiefs and rags stained with dried blood. Bricks from the alley near the biograph were auctioned off, as well as the clothes Dillinger was wearing the night he died. Most of Dillinger's gang and a number of men associated with him quickly followed their leader to the grave. Van Meter was tracked down by 4 police officers on August 23rd and cornered in the St. Paul area, his body riddled with bullets. The following month, Charles Mackley and Harry Pierpont, awaiting execution in Ohio, repeated Dillinger's famous ruse by making 2 fake guns in their prison cells. When they tried to use them on September 23rd, Mackley was shot and killed, and the wounded Pierpont survived only to be executed in the electric chair on October 17th. Babyface Nelson was similarly killed in a shootout with authorities. After being released from prison, Dillinger's main girlfriend, Billie Frechette, continued to talk about her ex at fairs. Dillinger's last girlfriend, Polly Hamilton, remained in Chicago. Both women died of cancer in 1969, 1 month apart. An unlikely victim of the Dillinger case was Agent Melvin Purvis. A few months after Dillinger's death, he led the manhunt for Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, which ended with Floyd's death on an Ohio farm on October 22, 1934. He was one of several agents who shot Floyd. Purvis had earlier made a series of comments in the press about the prosecution of Nelson that angered the ambitious Hoover. Purvis had gotten more fame than the director, and this could no longer continue. Hoover simply hounded him and forced him out of the bureau a year after Dillinger's death. Winstead, the man credited with the shot that killed Dillinger, also left the FBI in 1943 after a run-in with Hoover. He died in New Mexico in 1973 at the age of 82. Hoover died a year before Winstead in 1972. Never resigning as director or fearing presidents because of what he knew about them, Hoover always used Dillinger to build his image. Up until his death, he considered the bank robber's death his greatest success. Richard Gid Powers wrote that Hoover was so infatuated with Dillinger that 40 years later he spoke of his rival as if he were still alive. According to Powers, beginning in 1937, Hoover's office became a sort of unofficial Dillinger museum. Among the exhibits were the outlaw's post-mortem mask, the gun he carried the night of his death, the straw hat, and even the coins and a woman's photograph that were in his pockets. In truth, it was the year-and-a-half-long pursuit of Great Depression-era bank robbers and kidnappers, and especially Dillinger's death, that had ensured the FBI's fame. Hoover's agency needed a celebrity. The director clearly recognized this, which might explain his lifelong obsession. Immediately after the deaths, executions, and captures of the principal perpetrators in 1934, the Hoover publicity machine did its best to revise the story of Dillinger's murder. The tale was invented by Rex Collier under Hoover's direction and published in a 6-part newspaper special. According to Collier, Hoover personally led the Dillinger operation from Washington that night. It was the scientific methodology of the agency that led to its result. Purvis was mentioned, but his importance to the operation was diminished. Collier even added that Dillinger was afraid of the agency, trying to make the criminal look like a chicken when dealing with the FBI. A year after Dillinger's death, James Cagney was cast as a bureau agent in the movie G-Men. Cagney played what Hoover wanted, a new kind of lawman. Intelligent, college-educated, and using scientific procedures to solve crimes. The 1935 film put teamwork above personality and emphasized the use of science and agents trained in martial arts and gun shooting. So the FBI gradually began to create its own legend, with which we're very familiar today. And none of this would have happened without John Dillinger. His fame, which still rumbles on to this day, has several causes. Part of it has to do with his innate charisma and intelligence. Even if people didn't like his activities, it was fun to follow his adventures. He was known as a stylishly handsome man who almost always behaved in a gentlemanly manner, especially during bank robberies, where he put on a whole show with signature moves. Another element of the legend were his numerous and intriguing escapes. The incredible breakout from Crown Point, the thrilling getaway from Little Bohemia. It was like a live-action movie with an incredible plot, played out at a time when millions of people were tormented by boredom. His legendary status as a Robin Hood, though not true, still added points to his popularity and myth-building. After all, he robbed banks, institutions that the public believed were ripping off honest citizens. And according to legend, he chose those banks that were infamous among the ordinary people. However, the public often overlooked the fact that those around Dillinger on both sides of the barricades constantly died. Dillinger's biographer, Elliot Gorn, reminds those caught up in the Robin Hood allure that the bank robber traveled with a gang of talented killers. The Dillinger family continues to deny the murder of Officer William O'Malley in East Chicago by their famous relative, but numerous witnesses were willing to testify against him at Crown Point had he not escaped. Harry Pierpont and Charles Mackley were convicted of the proven murder of Lima Sheriff Jess Sarber. Although Babyface Nelson was never charged, simply because he was never arrested, the numerous brutal murders of this psychopath are well documented. Dillinger knew the kind of life he was leading. "The world is a very dangerous place," he once joked. "Few get out alive." He knew how it would end, and he was partying hard, making the most of every second of his life. The charm of a doomed man always attracted people. Another reason for Dillinger's legendary status was that it seemed like a return to the romantic and exciting days of the Wild West. 50 years had passed since the heyday of Jesse James, Billy the Kid, the Dalton Gang, and other Old West bank robbers. The last job Dillinger had planned was a train robbery, which was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid's main occupation. The public saw in Dillinger a resemblance to famous figures of the past. But Dillinger always brought with him a new style. The clothes he and his gang wore were colorful, the cars they drove were new and fast, and they always had beautiful ladies around them. If you omit the fact that they were gangsters, try to find the differences between Dillinger's gang and movie stars. Dillinger's story never ended. It lives on in books and movies, and museums have opened in almost every place where he walked, including Crown Point, Little Bohemia, and the Biograph movie theater. The feature films The Lady in Red and Dillinger and Capone suggest that Dillinger actually escaped that night, and the FBI shot the wrong man. Several writers and speculators claimed that the story put out by the Bureau was just a cover-up. The Dillinger gang was credited with stealing nearly $500,000. The dollar amount, however, could not be matched for human lives. 22 people, 11 law officers, and 11 outlaws, including Dillinger, were killed or executed during the bank robbers' rampage from 1933 to 1934 in the Midwest. 6 civilians died, the wounded number in the dozens. Even so, the Dillinger legend still lives on in the public's imagination.